Hello and welcome to the New Lines podcast. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. And this is a podcast where we delve into some of the biggest ideas, events, and personalities in the Middle East and beyond. My guest today is Yascha Mounk, a political scientist at Johns Hopkins University and a journalist who's written for the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and The Atlantic. His book, The Great Experiment: Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure, takes a broad look at global history to answer the question of how we can learn to live together in spite of our differences. At a moment when it seems as if Americans can't agree on anything, when political divisions seem more prominent in the country's politics than they have since probably the civil rights era, it's a particularly urgent question. Yascha, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
What prompted you to start thinking about that question, about how Americans can learn to live with one another in terms of this concept of diverse democracies?
Well, I've been working for a number of years on the rise of populism, the crisis of democracy. In fact, I like to say that I'm a democracy hipster. I was worried about the stability of our democratic systems, but before it was cool. And, one of the reasons for the rise of populism has been said by many people, and I broadly agree with that, to be the set of demographic changes that we've seen in many Western democracies in particular. The fact that a country like Britain, like Germany, where I grew up, in certain ways like the United States as well, has just come to be much more ethnically and religiously diverse over the course of the last decades than it was 50 or 100 years ago. And, as the conversation really came to center on that topic, I noticed that people were starting to be incredibly pessimistic about it, that there's a sort of pessimism on the right and the far right, which essentially says the strength of our countries used to be that they're more homogeneous and that, they're populated by, quote unquote, the right sort. And now that these immigrants are coming in, this is going to pose these tremendous problems. But also a pessimism among the left and the center, among my friends and colleagues, which basically said that this is such a hard challenge, and our countries are so defined by racism and discrimination that we really are not going to succeed in meeting that challenge, and that perhaps it's inevitable that these crazy right wingers are gonna win. And so I wanted to. I hate this phrase, to double click on this topic and say, all right, is this really new? I think it is. Is it really hard? I think it is. Are we really screwed? No, I actually think that we've made real progress over the last decades and can continue to build on that. And so that's the topic and the main thesis of this book.
So you broadly accept the idea that the diversity of democracies today is new and that it is broadly let's say a challenge. I was going to say a problem, but let's say a challenge.
Yes. So, there's some important distinctions between the established democracies. Countries like Britain and Germany and France and Italy and so on, we were quite homogeneous at the founding compared to what we have today. When you go back to the United Kingdom in 1950 or so, a huge majority of people living in the country had been born there, had parents who were born there, had grandparents who were born there, who had great-grandparents who were born there. Most, by a very large margin, were white. Most, by a very large margin, were Christian. Today none of these things are true. You have a much larger number of people who are born outside of a country, much larger number of people who have parents or grandparents who were born outside of a country. You have many more Britons today who have origins in Asia and Africa and the Middle East. And of course, you have much more religious diversity as well. So that's a fundamental change. In countries like the United States, it's a little bit more complicated because America, of course, has always been very diverse. At the moment of the founding of the American Republic, there's already a lot of Black Americans in the country, and there was, of course, Native Americans and others. But they were always excluded from the political system. So the solution was as simple as it was unjust, which is simply to say, look, you don't really count. You're outside of our political structures. In some cases, you are enslaved in the most terrible ways. And so, the question of how do we sustain a democracy with people who have these very different identities, sometimes very different convictions, wasn't that hard, because the solution was simply domination and exclusion. And so what we're trying to do now in the United States is to have this deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracy, which has become more diverse than it was in the past, but that most importantly actually is trying to treat its citizens as true equals. And that too is a new departure point. So that's why I call the book The Great Experiment, because it is a big challenge. We can talk about why it's a challenge. But most importantly, it is new. We don't have a playbook for here's how we do it.
Okay. And what is the challenge precisely? Because if the issue arises around racial and religious diversity, what are the challenges? You talked about a difference of identity, but it sounds like you also mean a difference of values, of political values.
Well, not necessarily of political values, but that can be the case in certain contexts. I think that the challenge, first of all, is just that human beings are deeply groupish, that they have this deep tendency towards forming groups and favoring the in-group over everybody else. In the book, I tell the story of Henry Teifel, a social psychologist who actually was working in England in the 50s and 60s. And he was really shaped by World War II, and he wanted to understand not just whether groups had this tremendous power over us and could motivate some of the worst crimes in history, because he knew that intimately in those famous studies like the Milgram experiment, the Stanford prison experiment, that were showing that every day. But why that is? He's like, what is it about groups that makes them so powerful? And so he had this really intuitive idea to say, look, I'm going to create groups that are so silly, but are so devoid of meaning, that nobody is going to be acting on their behalf. And then I will slowly ladle on new characteristics to them until they motivate people in those ways. And that'll teach us what makes groups act in these kind of extreme ways. And so he got
And
a
that
bunch
that experiment worked, did it?
Well, it failed, in fact. So he got a bunch of kids in from Bristol, where he was teaching, into the lab, and teenagers. He showed them a sheet of paper with, let's say, about 150 dots on it, and he said, have a guess how many dots are on the sheet of paper. And so some said 125, and some said 175. He said, great. So I'm going to have underestimators and overestimators. And he had them playing a simple allocation game, and it turned out that the underestimators started immediately to discriminate against the overestimators, and the overestimators discriminated against the underestimators. So he failed because he tried to create a group that was silly enough that people wouldn't act on its behalf, and it turns out that there are no such groups, that our instinct to favor the in-group is so strong that we're infinitely inventive in the kind of lines that we draw. Now,
but if we are infinitely inventive in the way that our identities are made, doesn't that suggest that the idea that racial and religious distinctions can be fluid? Because you don't have to necessarily identify with a particular religious or racial group, even if you come from that group. You might identify politically, you might identify culturally with something else. You might say, I'm into football, you're into cricket, or whatever.
I think that's exactly right. But there's 2 points here. So the first is that we know from history that there are some lines of identity which tend to lead to more conflict than others. So we don't have many historical examples of underestimators fighting against overestimators. We have some that are a little bit difficult to understand in retrospect, like the Guelphs versus the Ghibellines. But most of the worst conflicts in human history have been along the lines of ethnicity, of religion, of tribe, of language, of nation. So there are some recurring usual suspects which have motivated many of the worst wars and civil wars and genocides and forms of ethnic cleansing. And that I think we should be deeply aware of. Now, at the same time, you're absolutely right that what your primary line of identity is and how motivating it is really does depend on the context. And so I tell another story in the book about the Chawas and the Tumbukas, 2 tribes which live on both sides of a border between Malawi and Zambia. And so a political scientist went to Malawi, and he went to a Chawa village, and he asked Chawas about their opinion of Tumbukas. And they said, look, Tumbukas have these weird cultural, rites where they dance all wrong at the weddings, not like we do. And once the newlywed couple gets married, they go and live with the bride's family. That's weird. They should obviously live with the groom's family.
Obviously, it's crazy.
Obviously.
Yeah.
And when he asked, would you ever marry a Tumbuka, or would you ever vote for a Tumbuka political candidate? And most Shawas said, no, I couldn't imagine such a thing. Now he went to a Tumbuka village, and it turned out they had exactly the same prejudices in reverse, right? Like their rights are weird, their dances are all wrong. Why do we go and live with a groom's family? They should live with a bride's family. So it looked at first sight like what journalists like to call at the time of the war in Yugoslavia, sort of these primordial hatreds. These people have always hated each other. They're always going to hate each other. There's nothing to be done about that.
Yeah.
But then this political scientist traveled across the border to Zambia. Now, the border between Malawi and Zambia is one of those typical colonial borders drawn, by some Brit on a map who's probably never even been to the place
Always
in the 19th century.
And always
a Briton, yes.
Always on the map, yeah.
And so, there is no deep cultural difference here between those two sides of the Malawi-Zambian border. But he went to a Chawa village in Zambia, and he asked people, how do you feel about Tumbukas? And he said, look, they have different rights. They dance differently at their weddings, and, they go and live with the bride's side of the family. That's not what we do. He said, well, how do you feel about that? Would you ever marry one of them? Would you ever vote for one of their candidates? I said, yeah, I could imagine marrying one of them. Why not? And I would vote for one of their political candidates. We went to a Tumbuka village in Zambia, and again, same story. They were actually aware of the cultural differences, but much more positive about the other tribe. So why is this? Well, the answer is political in this case. Malawi is a relatively small country, and these two tribes together make up the lion's share of the population. And so they are always competing against each other, and they're mobilizing against each other. And so they come to hate each other. In Zambia, these two tribes together are a relatively small part of the overall population, and political conflict tends to be between eastern tribes and western tribes. And so they actually are on the same side of a political coalition. And so that's why they have these more positive views against each other. So all of which is to say, I do think that there are some fundamental categories of identity which are more likely than others to lead to conflict when you look at history: ethnicity, religion, and a few others. But the extent to which they become politically noxious really does depend on the context. And one of the parts of a project of building diverse democracies is to make sure that people are always going to be members of their groups. They're always going to identify strongly with their religion and perhaps their national origin. But we also do want them to have a shared national identity, which allows them to say, hey, your ancestors may come from a different part of the world than mine, you may have a different religion than me, but we are also members of this nation together, and that gives us solidarity to each other.
But the example of the Chawas and the Tumbukas doesn't track directly onto modern democratic states, because in modern democratic states, so for example, in European states, there isn't a large minority versus a large minority. There is one majority in the UK, for example, white people who are 77% of the population, and lots of minorities. So doesn't it rather suggest that actually the minorities are going to be able to get on fine as long as there isn't some large minority fighting another large minority? Isn't that what you took away from the example of Zambia?
Well, I think it depends on the exact configuration, actually. So we have some research on this in political science, which is pretty suggestive, and which basically says that very homogeneous countries tend to do fine. Very diverse countries tend to do fine because nobody can hope to be in charge. Where you often get problems is when you have two relatively evenly matched groups, both of which can hope to win power. I think that actually tends to be, and it's really an area that you know much better than I do, the problem in some parts of the Middle East, right? If you have a country where you have 55% of Sunnis and 45% of Shias, that is exactly in the kind of sweet spot, negatively speaking, where each side is, hey, I can beat you out and I can be in power. So it depends on the exact constellation. Now, by the way, I think that is a reason why it's a very big mistake how people, especially in the United States, now tend to talk about the country. We've naturalized this way of speaking as, there's whites and there's people of color. And, by 2045 or thereabouts, people of color are going to be in the majority. So it's going to be a majority-minority country. And On the right, this inspires a lot of fears, down to conspiracy theories of the Great Replacement and so on. On the left, that's often talked about as a hopeful thing, that this means that the Democratic Party is going to win because it has more non-white voters, and there's going to be a big cultural transformation, big political transformation. I think sociologically, all of this is hogwash. When you look at the way the country works, it's not at all clear that the line lies easily between white and non-white. In some ways, it lies between black and non-black. In other ways, it's just a series of complicated lines. People who I mean, one of the utterly absurd aspects, by the way, of the American way of classifying race is that many people who have exclusively European origin and who are white in appearance, whatever that exactly might mean, are classified as people of color. Because if your ancestors are conquistadors who moved to Mexico, and then you moved from Mexico to the United States, then you're a Hispanic who counts at some bizarre level as a person of color. The only ethnic group that is nearly exclusively classified as white in the United States is, in fact, Arabs, because they do not count as people of color, and very few of them have a connection to Latin America, and so they're all white. So this whole, thing makes no real sense. But there's an important thing here, which is
before you say it, so you mean that the reason why Arabs are mainly classified as white is because they tend to come from one particular region, whereas, let's say, Europeans who migrated to Latin America and then migrated again, those ethnic groups are actually counted as being from Latin America. That's the...
Yeah, there's just this weird category of Hispanic, which then gets subsumed under people of color. But of course, if you know something about the politics of Latin America, there are stark ethnic divides within some of those countries. And there's many immigrants from Latin American countries who regard themselves as white, which is one of the reasons.
Argentina and so on.
Yeah, exactly. And so, according to this classification, somebody like Louis C.K. is a person of color. Because he in fact has a Mexican parent, a Mexican Jewish parent, as it happens. But the whole thing just doesn't make sense, right? And so I just think it's important to resist this narrative, which is based in, I think, a sociologically false description of a country as easily being split into these two blocks, but which might, if all of the institutions incorporate it and speak about it uncritically, come to have a kind of reality in which Americans really do start to think of themselves as, am I white or am I a person of color? And that is the most important defining thing about me. And that would be very dangerous, because then in a couple of decades, we have exactly the kind of even split between two groups with some kind of homogeneous self-identity that leads to very deep conflict. I don't think that's likely to happen, but if it does happen, it would be a very bad thing, not a good thing. It would be a very dangerous thing.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted us to kind of ponder this a little bit, because I'm like you. I mean, I've always been very uncomfortable with this idea that there is even such a thing as white people. I mean, there are so many different varieties of human beings, and then you layer on top of it this idea that people have political differences and cultural differences, and people like this and people like that. The idea that they can all form one kind of block is crazy. In exactly the same way that we wouldn't like to talk about that with communities that we consider to be minorities. So, for example, Arabs or Africans, we wouldn't like to say, "Oh, you guys are all the same." Surely people would get very offended about that. But we seem to be okay with lumping white people all together, and we don't think that's a problem. But I wanted us to kind of ponder it a bit, because isn't there, when you think about, well, first of all, actually, I wanted to ask if you are someone who I think considers himself to be of the left, but that's right, I think. Yeah, but you also put quite a lot of stock in the idea of racial and religious differences, and I wondered if that made you uncomfortable a bit.
Well, I mean, it does. It depends on what exactly you mean by putting stock in them, right?
Like you think that you think that those distinctions they really matter even over time. So unlike what we were talking about with cultural differences, which can change, you think that there is much more likely to be conflict around religious differences or around racial differences, because those in some ways hold more water for a longer period of time.
Yeah, so let me tell you sort of perhaps my personal story on this, because it helps to explain where I fall on these things. So, I come from a Jewish family. My ancestors have been in the wrong place at the wrong time for many generations. And my grandparents actually, grew up in shtetls in Central and Eastern Europe, on the territory of what today is the Ukraine. And they, as teenagers, became communists because they had a universalist brand of leftism, right? What appealed to them about leftism, about the promises of communism, which were never kept, was the idea that, whether you happen to be Jewish or not, whether you happen to come from one ethnic group or another, was going to matter a lot less. That is not what we should base our politics around. And so, they experienced in terrible ways the failings of the communist regimes, including the failing to live up to that basic universalist aspiration. They were thrown out of Poland in 1968 when the government went on a big state-sponsored anti-Semitic campaign. And my parents, who were 20 years old, were thrown out of the country that they grew up in. But what I do still inherit from them is a form of universalist leftism. That is actually the thing that, in my mind, makes me a lefty. I mean, I also think a generous welfare state is good and so on. But at the most fundamental level, it is this hope that we should not let these ethnic and cultural and religious differences set us apart. At the same time, and when I was young, part of how that played out was that I thought we should all be individuals, or perhaps we should all be cosmopolitans who care equally about every person in the world as they do about people in their own country and so on, but we shouldn't define ourselves by groups at all.
Yeah.
And part of what's changed in the last 20 years is my recognition of how powerful groups are psychologically, as we see in that experiment TIFL, but also politically. What happens, for example, if we allow the worst kinds of people to monopolize the symbols of a nation? If the only person waving an American flag is Donald Trump, that makes it easier for him to win. And that is of very deep concern to me. And so I think that, in aspiration, I remain a universalist leftist. And I, in fact, find the extent to which parts of the left have given up that universalist aspiration for forms of identity politics to be deeply troubling. But I also think that we have to be realistic about the ways in which people will always be groupish, and in which a form of a groupism will often take an ethnic or cultural or religious form. So we need a society in which we encourage people to build links beyond those kinds of divisions, in which we ensure that they have forms of solidarity that are derived from things other than those kinds of ethnic groups in particular. But we also need to have a philosophically liberal society, a free society, in which people feel that they can be true to those kinds of group identities without having to come into conflict with others.
And that, I suppose, is a message that perhaps resonates more easily in an American context, particularly if you're talking about the public identification of faith, which is something that you will know from your time in Europe is not something that is particularly common in Europe. It's something that's, because of the history of European conflicts, there's a tendency to frown upon it. But it sounds as if you are quite comfortable with it. And it also sounds as if you are quite comfortable with the idea of public displays of patriotism, of flag waving.
Well, so it depends, again, on the exact context. I think Britain actually went extremely far in a kind of public endorsement of religion. When you look at the governments of the 90s and 2000s, they embraced, for example, state-sponsored faith schools, in which the state pays for schools which are Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or Sikh, and which limit their enrollment in these kinds of ways. I think that's a terrible mistake, because that goes beyond the natural right to free association, which people, of course, have, beyond the fact that many people will choose to remain mostly within their religious communities and think that that's the most important thing in their lives, and most of their friends and acquaintances and perhaps even business partners are going to stem from the same community. That's fine. That's a freedom you have in a country not just like the United States, but also like the United Kingdom. That's fine. But for the state to actually encourage forms of education in which children are completely segregated from anybody who doesn't have the same faith, and often from anybody who doesn't have the same kind of cultural and ethnic origin as a result, that I think is a really grave mistake. So,
but the reasoning. But let me just press you on this, because I'm interested in this. Because Yascha, the reasoning that the Blairite governments gave at the time for that sounds like the kind of reasoning that you might accept. Their reasoning at the time was to say that people wanted these faith schools, that people were anyway going to send their children to these sorts of schools, that they wanted that common heritage. So what's the difference? Why don't we encourage them? Because those faith schools were also doing well academically. That sounds like the
I
kind of yeah.
No, I don't think that's exactly right. There was also at the time a very popular surge of communitarian thinking, communitarian political philosophy. And when you look at some of the documents that the government published at the time, it really was casting Britain as a group of groups, as a community of communities, in which the fundamental status of each citizen was as much as a member of their group as it was as a particular citizen, or I suppose, as you might say in Britain, subject in the country. And so it was in certain ways closer to something like the Lebanese model, where you're really deeply defined politically and in other ways by whether you're a Shia or whether you're Sunni or whether you're a Maronite Christian. I'm not saying that Britain at the time looked like that. It was very far from Lebanon lived reality. But there was an influential strain of thinking which lionized that kind of communitarianism. Now, here's where I stand. I have a whole chapter in the book that tries to puzzle through what is the appropriate relationship between the state, the group, and the individual. And I reject two kinds of false starts. One is a form of liberalism which says, everybody should just be an individualist, right? I live a very individualistic life. I'm sort of a liberal both in the political sense and the comprehensive sense. But I think it would be a mistake for me to say, I think everybody needs to be like me. Nobody should be deeply religious. Nobody should choose to spend most of the time within the religious community. That is a kind of form of imperialism, actually. I have to have respect for my fellow citizens who are much more religious, much more devout than I am. And they should have freedom to live in the ways that they want as well. And I think that philosophical liberals, and I count myself as a left-wing philosophical liberal, philosophical liberals have, I think, often gone wrong on this. And so there's a bit of internal critique here. But I also very firmly reject the communitarian model, the model which says that you're defined as a member of your religious or other kind of cultural or ethnic community, because that has really deep downsides as well. First of all, it makes it really hard to have effective democratic control over the rules which bind you. It makes it really difficult to build real connections between different people. I have two friends in Lebanon who got married, and the state for years would not accept and recognize their union because they stem from different religious communities. That is a nightmare of the kind of society we might build. I think the image of a salad bowl or a mosaic where we just live next to each other, and sometimes perhaps we look up and sort of appreciate, oh, look, there's this cute little community over there, and I like that one too, but, I've never spoken to them. That is a really nightmarish vision of a kind of country we should build. And so the way that I think about it is that we have to have a double freedom. We have to have freedom from people who are members of other groups that might want to oppress us. That means that if I'm in a political minority, I need to be able to robustly criticize the government without having to be afraid of going to jail, as so many brave dissidents around the world are going to jail now. Yeah. It also means, of course, that I have to be able to worship in ways that the majority of my fellow citizens dislike, without having to fear that they will jail me or forbid me from building my house of worship or turning up at my doorstep and intimidating me. So I have to have protection against outsiders. But there's also a second freedom we need, and that is the freedom from our own group. That historically, very often, the form of oppression that people have faced is their own parents, their own aunties and uncles, their own priests and imams and rabbis. And we need to make sure that in our society, if you want to leave a community in which you grew up, if you want to date somebody your parents disapprove of, if you want to strike out on your own, you're also able to do that. And communitarians cannot explain why that is the case. I drew a very clear line there. We need to have protection against a tyrannical state, but we also need to have a state that's strong enough to come and rescue us from our own communities when our own elders, our own parents are telling us, you must live this way and we're going to punish you in some kind of way if you don't.
I like this analogy you've drawn between the experience of Lebanon and the UK. I mean, the problem with Lebanon, as you've outlined, and I was very pleased to hear you expound on it, is that it hands too much power to communal and religious gatekeepers, because these are now the community leaders and the religious leaders that decide how the community is perceived, what its norms are, and so forth. But if you think about Britain as an example, I like this idea that you think that there was a tendency to be communitarian in the 2000s, that the country or the political leadership of the country thought of the nation as being a collection of communities. I wonder if you can say more about that, and why do you think that is so dangerous? Because there are other countries in Europe as well which would think of themselves as being that, collections of communities, associations, and they come together to form a state.
Um, well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know where you're thinking. Perhaps Switzerland or Belgium or something like that. Those cases I think slightly different, because you have uh, sort of different linguistic or national communities which have pre-existed for a very, very long time, and they enter into a kind of confederation. That's a very complicated process, and it's rare that it works out well. It's still not clear to me that Belgium will exist in its current form in 100 years. But that in itself, I don't have a problem with. I think when different groups have very long-standing cultural differences and are geographically concentrated, and they have certain forms of regional autonomy, as Quebec does in Canada, that's perfectly fine. Where I worry about is when you start to say, hey, we're going to have these different religious or cultural communities living on the same territory, but they're going to be bound by different sets of rules and obligations. Because there you very quickly get into the territory of uh, uh, creating a whole bunch of disadvantages for people. One of which is that if you're not clearly a member of one or the other group, if you have parents from both different groups, your life becomes very, very difficult. One of the problems is that it then all the pressures of society start to militate against building connective tissue, against people making friendships together, against people cooperating, and that becomes very dangerous. The starting point of this in political science was a very influential set of theories by a Dutch scholar called Arend Leiphardt, who looked at Lebanon and said, this is the solution. If you have these deep conflicts between different religious or cultural groups, you simply devolve all of the decisions down to the communal level. And that way you can keep the peace. And in a way, that's understandable, right? If you have people fighting over what the right marriage or divorce laws would be because they have these very different cultural religious ideas,
Yeah.
well, just devolve it down a level, and then you have less to fight over, and perhaps that'll work. The problem is that he published this as the solution, and it turned out to be very influential for decades to come, in 1969. And a few years later, you had the outbreak of a really protracted and bloody civil war. Because one thing that these kinds of communitarian solutions do is to cast current divisions of identity in stone. And this is something we should be very, very careful about. Why is the Netherlands less pillarized today than it was in the past? Why it's less defined by the very stark division you used to have in the country between Catholics and Protestants and liberals? Well, because the country became more secular and those distinctions became less important. Today it's a much less divided society. And that's a good thing. The country was able to evolve in that kind of way. If all of the rights and duties you have in a country are shaped by your ascriptive identity, it becomes much less likely that the lines of division become more porous. And that means that you freeze conflicts and increase the likelihood of bad outcomes up to and including civil war.
Hmm. I want to take the Lebanon example and move on a step, because I wonder if we can think a bit about the historical context between different groups. We're having a kind of an abstract debate about the effect of in-group bias, but if we're talking about Lebanon or the United States, the intercommunal conflict and the divisions between these groups, they exist because of a very real history, a history of injustice, and if that isn't resolved, then the tensions are likely to re-emerge sometime in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So I talk in the book about the three sort of historic modes of failure of diverse societies, which include fragmentation, as in the case of Lebanon, which includes forms of structured anarchy, as in places that just have never really managed to build an effective state because different groups mistrusted each other so much, as is the case in Afghanistan and in Somalia, arguably. But the third, and in some ways most important, is domination, is societies in which one group has historically dominated and subjugated the others in ways which often has very long-lasting after effects. And that is obviously the case with chattel slavery in the United States, and that continues to characterize the country in deep ways today. Um, Part of what it is to resolve that history is to find ways to address those failings and to make sure that the fate of people living in the society does not forever continue to depend on the mistreatment that their ancestors experienced, and that is indeed a very important part of the solution of the puzzle. But then, when you're talking about history, you also have to be exact, right? Let's go back to this way that people really very casually and normally and naturalized way speak about whites and people of color in the United States. Well, it's one thing to be descended from generations and generations of people who've endured slavery and Jim Crow and really the worst crimes of American history. But if somebody has European royal ancestry on one side and Indian Brahmin ancestry on the other side, and grows up, let's say, in the affluent suburbs of New York City, going to some of the top private schools in the country, to say that that person is a person of color in a similar or comparable way to the person who grows up in a really deeply impoverished neighborhood in the south side of Chicago, who's descended from these generations of slavery. That is just bizarre, metaphysical, racialist thinking. It obscures much more about reality than it shows. So absolutely, you cannot understand America today without understanding the way in which slavery and other forms of mistreatment of African Americans continue to shape the country today. But to take that and to derive from it this essential metaphysical division between whites and people of color is just very strange.
But don't you think that part of the reason that divide continues to exist is because the history of injustice hasn't been dealt with? That there hasn't been a reckoning with what happened in the past with these historically dominant groups, and because of that, these divisions continue to exist.
Well, it depends on the exact nature of a division. I don't think that's a good explanation for why, the kind of individual I just sort of thought about counts as a person of color, or is sort of, put in one kind of ledger of those historical questions. That doesn't make sense to me at all. Is the fact that actually the division between Black and non-Black Americans, or perhaps even more narrowly between descendants of slaves and other Americans, including the very successful children and grandchildren of recent Kenyan and Nigerian immigrants.
Right.
It's the reason why that line is so stark, the historical injustice that has been visited upon most Black people living in the United States today. Absolutely, 100%. And that is something that the country has to deal with. But let's be specific in what we're talking about, rather than using these categories of what Karen and Barbara Fields would call racecraft, in order to jump from one thing to a very simplistic, generalized view of what the country looks like.
But even if you try to be very specific about the way you talk about racial categories, at some point you do come up against the reality of that history of injustice. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is, and this is why I was making the Lebanon analogy, because the Lebanon analogy, if you think about the Taif agreement in the 1990s, this agreement merely froze the problems. It didn't resolve them. And I wonder why when you are thinking about how to move on from the history of injustice in the United States, why you don't feel that, for example, reparations for slavery is part of that conversation, to draw a line under it.
Well, I'm not sure where you're getting this, but I'm not opposed to reparations. Even if you take a libertarian approach, I'm not a libertarian, but if you take someone like Robert Nozick, he says that on a libertarian conception, there's three basic elements of justice. The first is justice in acquisition, that you have to acquire your property in a just manner. The second is justice in transfer, that nobody has robbed your money or expropriated it from you. And that, according to Nozick, can justify deep inequalities of outcomes. So if you have one star basketball player, and everybody starts off with $5 and everybody decides to pay 10 cents to see the star basketball player perform, then by the end of it, the basketball player will be really rich and the others will not be, and that's perfectly fine. But even Nozick recognizes that there also then has to be a form of rectificatory justice, which is to say that if it turns out that these stipulations aren't true historically, that somebody has acquired their property by stealing it, or somebody has in extreme way had the labor stolen from them for centuries, then that justifies some form of redress. And so on this very basic set of principles, it's obvious why you might end up thinking that you should have some form of reparations. And I'm not at all opposed to that in principle. I think there's complicated practical questions about what that would mean, but in principle, I'm in favor of that. Now, here's where I do become very careful. I would much rather have a very generous form of one-time reparation than some form of ongoing racial scheme where by virtue of the color of your skin, you then have a very different set of rights and duties within a country, because that precisely means that we are not redressing the historical injustice in ways that makes it easier to build a society where those distinctions become less important, because they're less shaping of fates and outcomes and all of those kinds of things.
Right.
But rather, we're building a society in which, in a lasting manner, you will be defined by your ethnicity. And that's particularly the case if, as is essentially the case in America, the sort of quasi-schemes of reparation that we choose, like affirmative action, which is not supposed to be a scheme of reparation, but clearly is motivated in many ways by that, then end up including a lot of people who have not historically experienced that injustice. So I have wonderful, wonderful students who are, kids and grandkids of immigrants from Africa, and I'm very, very happy that they're in my classroom. But the one strange point of overlap I have with a far left group that I normally disagree with, called the American Descendants of Slavery, ADOS, is that they're right to point out that it's kind of weird that 50+% of Black students at Ivy League universities in the United States are actually recent immigrants or children of recent immigrants from African countries and from elites in those countries, right? That's a really weird way of running a quasi-reparation scheme.
Yeah. The most famous, of course, being Barack Obama's father, who emigrated from Kenya.
And for that matter, Kamala Harris's ancestors, who I believe were enslaved, but not in the United States, right? So it's very interesting that you see a lot of people at the highest level of American society being the descendants of recent Black immigrants. And again, that reinforces the point you were making earlier on, right? How deeply the history of injustice continues to shape the country, and how hard it makes it for people who have experienced those centuries of injustice, whose ancestors have experienced those centuries of injustice, to rise to the very highest levels in society. So this is, a reason to deal with, another reason to deal with it. It's not a reason not to deal with it. But there is a weird hesitance to point that out in the United States. And one of the most undertold stories about contemporary America is the complicated relationship that Black Americans whose ancestors have been in the country for a very long time have with Black Americans whose parents or grandparents immigrated more recently from African countries.
Yeah, very underexplored. Let's move on then to talk about the role of the state, because I wanted to ask you about your ideas about where the role of the state would fit in. You've talked about the importance of having a strong state in maintaining liberal rights and freedoms. And you've also said that it's important to energetically punish those who seek to undermine them.
Well, look, if you have a very diverse society with people with different sets of beliefs and so on, you want to draw the tent as broad as possible, right? You want to make it possible for people with the broadest possible set of different ideas about how they want to live and how they want to go about their life to coexist in peace, and hopefully not just in peace, but in some amount of solidarity. But of course, there are going to be people who are not willing to accept that. There are going to be people who say, unless you live the way I do, I'm going to go and beat you up. Unless you worship the way I do, I'm going to go and threaten you.
Yeah.
And even though we should be as not just tolerant, but as welcoming as possible to different ways of living and to different ways of going through your life and what you think is important to you, that is one of the key promises of free society. The moment that somebody starts to threaten their fellow citizens for doing the same thing, for going about their lives peacefully, you have to have a state that intervenes very clearly and without being apologetic about it.
And I guess I wonder where you can draw the line, though, because I'm thinking about it in the context of the Middle Eastern perspective, where there are some powerful generals who will tell you that they are protecting people's rights when they suppress elections and arrest opposition members. And there are actually liberals in the Middle East who would be happy about that repression. So afraid are they of the Islamists who they think might repress them. Is it justifiable for the state to go that far?
Well, I'm talking here about what the rules are by which a democratic state is bound, right? So I'm talking about what are you free to do as an individual citizen and what are you not free to do as an individual citizen. Now, you're free to engage in whatever form of worship you want. You're free to sort of cut yourself off from a lot of society, as Amish do in the United States, for example. And all of that should be acceptable. You're not free to say, hey, if you have that sexual partner, I'm going to beat you up. You're not free to say, unless you worship in the way that I wish, or unless you refrain from saying things that I find to be hurtful to my religion, I'm going to attack you in some kind of way. So that's what I'm talking about here. What you're talking about is a situation in which you don't have established democracies, and in which some people then claim that the reason why they want to exercise power, or the reason why they want to stage a military coup, for example, is that they care about those kinds of values. Now, I think most of the time that is insincere in any case, and it doesn't strike me, for example, that in a country like Egypt, there are meaningful liberal rights, because the most fundamental liberal rights, which is to criticize the government, to organize against it, certainly is going to land you in prison pretty quickly. But we can talk about sort of what you do in situations in which a big majority of the population really is deeply anti-liberal, and what kind of institutions are appropriate there. That's not the topic that I was talking about. And I certainly tend to be very skeptical that people who claim to be defending individual rights in those circumstances, in fact, do or will.
And the place, of course, when you talk about people being attacked, the place where you see people being attacked most these days is not really in public, it's in the public sphere. And this is something that you've grappled with, about the question of how we should engage with each other in the public sphere, like on Twitter and so on. You call it the most important battleground in the fight to reinvigorate pluralist values. Why do you think the way that we talk on social media or in the public sphere through the media, why do you think that matters now so much in terms of the discourse?
Well, I would reframe that a little bit, because I think everybody is free to say what they want on social media. In fact, I'm close to a free speech absolutist. I think there should be very few restrictions on what you can say on social media. Now, I would like for people to have respectful political discourse with each other. That's certainly what I try. Don't always succeed, but try to live up to myself. I don't think that calling people names or vilifying people as a particularly healthy or productive form of political discourse. But you should be free to do that. I come from a country, Germany, where I can't say, let's say that the chancellor is an asshole. If I said that publicly, he could sue me and he would win, and I'd have to pay some money to him. I think that's absurd. So people should be free to do what they want. What I worry about is less what people say on social media than the way in which a lot of very influential social institutions are now run by social media. So that when a set of people criticize a university professor or comedian or somebody else on social media, their universities or their employers or their networks listen to what is often a minority opinion, what is often the opinion of a very small number of ideologically extreme people, and then go and fire those people. And as a result, you do have a situation in which a huge number of people feel unable to think and reflect and speak freely about the world. I have great students who I really enjoy teaching. One of the things that makes me sad is when I speak to them is that when I was in college, we would stay up till 2 or 3 a.m. debating the world, and it was a free-flowing, fearless conversation, which we're trying on ideas. We're doing that in an earnest way, by the way. We weren't trolling
Yeah.
around. We're trying to
Yeah.
figure
Yeah.
out what
Yeah.
we think about the world. But it
Yeah.
was fearless. We didn't think, tomorrow I'm going to get in trouble for what I say drunkenly at 2 a.m. to my friend as I'm trying to grapple with the world. When I speak to my students now, most of them say we don't have that they would never talk about controversial issues in the dining hall. Perhaps there's one or two friends whom they trust to have those kinds of conversations with. That is really upsetting to me. And in fact, there's just a new poll out which shows that the number of students on campus who say that there's a lot of people who don't feel comfortable expressing their views has increased dramatically over the last years and is now in a majority. So if you have the people who are being educated to be leaders in the society not able to actually speak their mind to their friends when they're in college, you know that you have a social crisis.
You think that that cancel culture is much more dangerous than just merely being something that happens in the academy. You think that as those people go out into the world, it will have an influence on the political culture, which will be detrimental.
Well, it already has. I mean, I'm struck by the way in which, when I arrived in the United States 15 years ago, I never heard people say casually. Of course, I would never say this in public. Now in the
Mm.
United States, again, my friends are sort of, like left of center academics and think tankers and journalists. I hear that phrase in virtually every conversation. Oh, of course, I'd never say this publicly. And by the way, that is a lot of the appeal of the far right, because people can smell this. People can
Mm.
smell, for example, that a lot of congressmen in the United States will not say what they actually think because they're fearing rebellions from their own staff. Right? They will not take a position, not because they think it's right on principle, or not because they think that it'll win them or lose them an election, but
Yeah.
because they're worried that the 25-year-old staffers are going to denounce them and that'll get them into all kinds of complicated problems. Voters smell that. And why can somebody like Donald Trump be competitive? Not because most Americans love Donald Trump, but because they say, you know what, I don't much like Trump and I don't much trust him. But I don't trust that the other guys even tell me what they really think. Why should I
Yeah.
trust him to stand up for my interests?
Do you think that the left, of which you are part, have adequately grappled with the consequences of that?
No, I don't think that.
Where do you think they are in that transition? Where do you think that they are at the moment?
Well, I do think that things have been becoming a little bit better for a couple of years for two reasons. One is that um, part of what allowed those very restrictive speech norms to take over was Donald Trump being in office, right? Because at a moment at which the threat from Trump and the populist right was so present and just so, in your face every damn day, um, uh, anybody who criticized people on quote unquote their own side started to look like a traitor, right? Like, why are you criticizing anything on the left when Trump is there? You're
Yeah.
just secretly running interference for him or something like that. And that
Yeah.
allowed the worst kinds of ideas to take over and made it much more likely for him to be reelected, by the way. And then the second is that you're seeing many of these ideas being put into place, and you're starting to see very bad results from that and very bad impact from that in the real world, and people are fed up with it. So in San Francisco, for example, you had um, uh, you know very far left members of a local school board who, during the pandemic, when public schools in San Francisco were closed pretty much throughout the pandemic, where thinking about renaming schools named after Abraham Lincoln. And so instead of making sure that kids get an education, that parents get a break from having to look after their kids 24/7, they were engaged in these, really silly language games. And some of these most visible members of the school board have now been voted out of office in a recall election in a very, very left-leaning city. I think that's because
Mm.
people were seeing the negative practical consequences that ensue when nobody dares to oppose those ideas.
Lastly, then, I wanted to ask you, this is my last question to you, and I wanted to ask you about optimism and what it is about the current state of the diverse democracy that we live in that makes you optimistic.
Yeah, it's great actually. I think it's been a lovely conversation where it's given insights into some of my thinking and many of the themes of the book, but it's leaving one big piece out, which is why I'm optimistic. So I'll say a little bit about it at the end of the conversation, but if people really want to find out why I'm optimistic, they'll have to read the damn book. The Great Experiment. This is my sales pitch.
It's very good.
But to give you a sense of it, I think that a lot of people in this debate start with a really easy optimism, which I would have had 20 years ago as well. And that's, how hard can it be to build these diverse democracies? Why do we need to be defined by all of these different kind of identity questions? It should be easy. And yet, you're looking at present reality and you're seeing discrimination and racism and the rise of far right and all of these other kinds of problems. And then it becomes very time to say, well, look, if we're failing at this really easy task, then there must be something uniquely wrong with us. We must suck. And that must mean that there's no hope for the future. Now, in my book, I sort of, the movement of the argument, if you will, is the exact opposite. I start with a real recognition of the difficulties of our groupish nature, which makes it so easy to discriminate against outsiders, with the fact that historically these ethnic and religious boundaries have so often led to conflict, with something we haven't talked about, which is that democratic institutions can exacerbate this, because democracies always inspire a search for a majority. And so it becomes much more tempting to say, hey, if this other group is growing more quickly than mine, is this going to undermine my power? So there's real reasons why this is really hard. And when you go back to our societies today and you measure them by the yardstick of these difficulties, and you measure them, frankly, by their own past, I think you come out being much more optimistic. I think Britain, for example, for all of its problems and flaws, is a much more naturally inclusive and tolerant and forward-looking country today, a country in which people recognize in a much more natural way that people who have their origins on the Indian subcontinent or in the Caribbean or in other parts of the world are Brits like everybody else. That was the case even when I went to university there 20 years ago. When you look at the success of immigrants, the pessimism about this that you see on both sides of the political spectrum is just misplaced. It's the far right says that immigrants today are somehow inferior. Many people on the left say that they don't stand a chance because of discrimination and so on. The truth of it is that despite real discrimination that exists, they're succeeding at remarkable levels. In the United States, immigrants today from Mexico and El Salvador and Vietnam and Kenya are integrating and rising the socioeconomic ladder as quickly as Italian and Irish immigrants did a century ago. And so I think if you start with an appreciation of the difficulty of the Great Experiment, you can end with a hard-won optimism about our ability to meet these challenges.
Yascha Mounk, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed this.
Yascha's podcast is called The Good Fight. You can also buy his book, The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure, in all good bookshops. This week's podcast was produced by Joshua Martin and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. You can subscribe to the New Lines magazine podcast on your favorite podcast app. And of course, you can find more of the best stories from the Middle East and beyond on our website, newlinesmag.com. Thank you all for joining us.